All right, good afternoon. I'm John Peckenham, and I'm a research associate in the Mitchell Center, and I want to talk to you for a short while about PFAS and biosolids in Maine and what the Maine DEP sludge analyses collected to date tell us. And this is a story of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let us begin. So Maine DEP has a PFAS response team, and they've been out and they've sampled sources, wastewater treatment plant sludges, and wastewaters, and industrial sources, and sinks, which would be agricultural sites where these materials have been applied as agronomic additive, and also other exposure routes. So not just the soils, but groundwater and surface water near the fields that received these biosolids, the animals that grazed on these fields, and the wild animals that fed on these fields, like the deer in Fairfield, and also fish in rivers and streams in the receiving waters. And so they've been generating a tremendous quantity of data points across the state. The good news about biosolids, so going back into like the 1980s, 1990s, utilization of this wastewater treatment plant sludge was considered a good thing. It was an agronomic additive. It provided organic material, and it also provided some nutrients, some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There were regulations developed to protect soil and water quality, as well as guide the agronomic utilization. So nutrient calculations, as well as sort of, I guess we could call safety quality standards. Commercially, a lot of biosolids generated in Maine have been composted commercially or at facilities. This is a turner, so the sludges are added with a substrate like wood chips, and they're aerated. The turning the pile aerates them. They generate heat, which kills some of the pathogens in them, the bacteria and fungus naturally occurring in the substances would break down some of the organic matter, consume some of the nutrients, and make it a more stable, safe to handle product. But along with the good comes the bad. So sewage sludge have pathogens in them. They have heavy metals, they have dioxins, and now we know they have PFAS. So a lot of the early regulations focused on pathogen reduction. So treatment methods to reduce the potential for pathogens to get spread from the biosolids. Heavy metals, heavy metal loading in soils was a big concern. EPA instituted industrial pretreatment programs to try to get a lot of those metals out of the waste stream and wastewaters. That improved the sludge quality. And then probably in the late 80s, early 90s, we recognized that there were dioxins in sludges, often from industrial sources. A lot of effort went into how do we manage this? How do we change industrial processes to reduce dioxins? And now we have PFAS, and it's not just industrial processes, but our data is suggesting that the PFASs are coming from everywhere. So we need to remember that the PFAS issue, in some sense, kind of exploded overnight into a crisis. But the regulatory goals for biosolids use were always to reduce risk to the public, to protect soil quality, protect water resources, in that the EPA, the state of Maine, had some standards for regulatory review so that they could evaluate the quality of the sludges, to explore by sampling new potential compounds of concern, and then to evaluate those concerns through a risk assessment, and then to determine if new regulation was necessary. So something happened with PFAS that we We collectively, as scientists and regulatory agencies and everyone else interested in these things, we missed the severity of the problem. It was recognized at military bases, and it was recognized at a few sites that could be probably more directly linked to industrial processes or leaking landfills. And then all of a sudden, we started looking, we realized that this problem is very widespread at low concentrations, and it's a great concern. And the state of Maine has really been pushing itself to the fore of this problem because the agricultural community has been significantly affected by PFAS. In terms of utilization of biosolids in Maine, again, land application really became big in the 1980s. Municipalities may, if they were large enough, made their own compost facilities, but there was the development of commercial composting facilities. And then there has been in the past and continues to be landfilling of biosolids. So this little pie diagram from the National Biosolids Partnership shows the distribution for 2018. 2019, of course, we had the pandemic and we had the PFAS problem. So those distributions now in this, as 2022 will be significantly different. But about 60% of the biosolids went directly to a landfill. And roughly 29% were composted into a Class A material and used either on farm field or in landscaping, and about 9% was directly used on agricultural land, and the rest went to diverse or unknown dispositions. So let's take a look at the data for wastewater treatment plant sludges. So these are municipal systems distributed around the state. This is for PFOA, and the darker the color, the higher the concentration. We see a scattering of darker shades, and then the white to creamy colors are the low concentrations scattered across the state. This map is just showing maximum concentration. So in some locations, the concentrations did vary considerably, maybe by a factor of 10. The PFAS concentrations, we see more darker colors than with PFOA, but the distributions, if I toggle back here, the distributions are a little bit different. So not the same locations are showing darker colors between PFOA and PFAS. In terms of the distribution of concentration, so this is based on 66 municipal treatment plants. We can see this it's a skewed distribution, and that bright red line is the state of Maine's new screening standard for land application of sludges, if it were to be allowed. The red line would be the maximum allowable concentration of PFOA in sludge, and you can see that the significant number of wastewater treatment plant sludges are above that standard. If we look at PFAS, we see a greater mass of sewage sludges being above the state land application beneficial use standard, which means that almost none of them, right? We have a very small tail off there to the left, but that would be below the acceptable maximum. And the indications are that the acceptable maximums are likely to get lower, which will move that red line further to the left, which will put more above the standard. In terms of the histograms, you can see these are all the results are very heavily skewed, which isn't too unusual for trace concentrations in the environment. And part of our continuing research is to understand why the distributions look like this. Can we partition out what is causing these PFAS and PFOA concentrations in wastewater treatment plant sludges? In terms of any kind of correlation between PFAS and PFOA, this is a log-log diagram. It looks like a really good random distribution. So one of the things I'm particularly interested in is, can we disaggregate some of these locations and find some other explanatory variables that may have some effect on PFAS and PFOA concentrations? Is there some structure, or this is just purely a random association between two chemicals in the same family? Where are we headed next? Well, this is still a work in progress, but particularly research will be continuing in what local or regional factors affect the presence of PFAS compounds. Are there other explanatory variables that would help us learn how to manage this crisis of PFAS better? What affects PFAS concentration variability in POTWs? So on some of the locations that had multiple samples, concentrations were similar from sample to sample, but in other systems, we see quite a bit of intersample variability, maybe a factor of 10 or greater. What's driving those differences? Is that something that will help us learn how to manage this problem? What are the consequences of restricting land application? So if all the biosolids go to the landfill, are we making a new kind of problem? Are our landfills, do we have the landfill capacity? I know that these are very low solids materials. They require particular handling and mixing at landfills to make the landfill itself stable. Can the landfill handle 30,000 cubic yards of additional low solids materials like a wastewater treatment plant sludge in the future? Alrighty, thank you very much for listening to me today. If you have questions, feel free to email me directly, jpeck@maine.edu. Thank you.